The prairie wind sang its lonely song across the vast emptiness of the American West. Dust devils spun lazily in the distance, and the sun glared down on a land that seemed too big for one man to inhabit alone. Yet for years, Ethan Cole had done just that. Ethan was a rancher, strong-shouldered and weather-worn, with hands that looked carved from stone and eyes as pale as the high desert sky. His ranch stretched for miles: fences, corrals, cattle, and a small clapboard house that stood like a stubborn sentinel against the wilderness. It was a place that could feed a man, clothe a man, even keep him alive. But it could not keep him company. And that, more than drought, more than coyotes, more than rustlers, was the danger that gnawed at Ethan Cole: the silence. Neighbors saw him ride into town now and then for supplies. He never lingered. He didn't join the card games at the saloon, didn't warm a pew at Sunday service, didn't smile at the widows who might have been glad for his attention. Folks whispered about him in lowered voices. Some said he was broken from the war. Others claimed he'd been jilted once by a woman and never trusted again. Children made up ghost stories about the loner rancher who never laughed. The truth was simpler and sadder. Ethan had loved once, back when he was young and foolish, and the memory of betrayal still hung around his neck like a millstone. He told himself he didn't need anyone. But the long winters said otherwise. The empty table at supper time said otherwise. The bed, cold and wide as the plains themselves, said otherwise. One late evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Ethan sat at his rough, hewn table with nothing but a tin plate and silence for company. He stared at the chair across from him. He'd tried to ignore it for years. Tonight, it stared back at him, mocking him with its emptiness. The ache in his chest grew heavier than he could bear. He pushed his plate away, stood up, and paced the room. His boots thudded against the floorboards, echoing in the hollow house. He knew what he needed, though pride had kept him from admitting until now. Finally, he pulled open a drawer, rummaged past old receipts and a half-used box of cartridges, and withdrew a sheet of paper. He sat back down, dipped his pen in ink, and began to write. Not to family, he had none left. Not to friends, he hadn't kept any. No, he wrote to an agency back east. A company that arranged marriages for men like him. Men too far from civilization to court in the usual way. Men willing to pay for the chance at companionship. A mail-order bride. The words didn't come easily. His hand shook more than it ever had holding a rifle. What did a man say to a woman he had never met? He kept it plain, as he did everything in life. My name is Ethan Cole. I am a rancher in Montana Territory. I own my land, my cattle, and my house. I am a hard worker. I am not a drinker. I need a wife who can help me keep my home and share my life. I offer security, and I will do my best to be a good husband. He stopped, staring at the letter. It felt bare. But honesty was all he knew. He sealed it, tucked in the payment, and the next morning rode into town to send it off on the eastbound mail coach. From that day forward, his life took on a new rhythm, waiting. Every morning, he rose before the sun as always, tended to his cattle, repaired fences, worked until sweat stung his eyes. But now, at the end of each long day, he found himself walking down the dirt road toward the old stagecoach trail. He'd stand there, boots planted in the dust, scanning the horizon for a plume of smoke, a creak of wheels, a sign that something, someone, was coming for him. The townsfolk noticed. Old man Jensen at the mercantile chuckled, "Cole's finally waitin' on something other than rain." Women whispered, "Maybe he's bringin' a bride." Poor girl. Ethan ignored them. For the first time in years, hope stirred inside him. Fragile, awkward but real, he imagined her, an American girl from Boston or New York perhaps, blonde or brown-haired, maybe soft-spoken, maybe lively, someone who would fill the empty chair. Who would smile at him across the table, who would make the cold bed warm. Night after night, he pictured her face in the firelight, though he had never seen it. He prayed, though he hadn't prayed in years, that she would not find him too rough, too quiet, too far gone. And so, the loner rancher waited. Waited for the sound of the stagecoach wheels. Waited for the woman who might change everything. Waited for the life he had almost given up believing in. What he didn't know, what no one could have told him, was that the day his bride arrived, she would not be the woman he had imagined. She would not even speak his language. But destiny was already on its way, riding the dust roads of the West toward him. The day finally came. The summer sun hung high and merciless over the Montana sky, baking the dirt road until the air shimmered. The faint sound of iron-rimmed wheels and hooves echoed from beyond the ridge. Ethan Cole stood by the weathered wooden platform of the stagecoach stop, boots planted in the dust, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes. For weeks, he had rehearsed this moment in his head. He pictured a tall young woman stepping off the coach, perhaps with a parasol, her dress pressed neat despite the long journey. He imagined she might smile shyly, her eyes bright with curiosity and a touch of fear. But willing to be his wife, his partner, the companion he had prayed for in the lonely hours of night. The townsfolk had gathered too, as they always did when the stage came in. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, hoping for candy from far-off cities. Old men leaned against hitching posts, spitting tobacco, eager for gossip. And all of them, every single one, stole glances at Ethan Cole, the rancher who never smiled, who now stood stiff as a soldier waiting for his bride. The stagecoach finally rattled into view, a cloud of dust trailing it like a banner. The driver reined in the team of sweating horses, their sides heaving. With a groan of brakes and a crack of the whip, the heavy coach rocked to a halt. The driver climbed down, doffing his hat. "Mail, parcels, and passengers," he called. He tossed down 2 sacks of letters, then swung open the door. Ethan's heart thudded. His throat tightened. The first passenger stepped down. A banker from Billings. Not her. Then a traveling salesman with a case full of pots and pans. Not her. Ethan's pulse quickened as the driver reached back inside, offering his hand. And then she appeared. A small, delicate figure in a plain blue dress, holding a wooden box against her chest as though it were her only possession. Her hair was black as raven feathers, her skin pale against the dust of the journey. Her eyes, dark, almond-shaped, full of both fear and resolve, swept across the crowd. She was not the woman Ethan had pictured. She was not from Boston or New York, or anywhere he had ever imagined. She was Chinese. A ripple of whispers moved through the gathered townsfolk. "Chinese," someone hissed. "Lord above, he sent for a foreigner." Another voice snickered. "Cole's bride can't even read the signs on Main Street." Children pointed, giggling. A woman clucked her tongue, muttering about shame. Ethan's jaw tightened. His first instinct was disbelief. There had to be some mistake. This wasn't what he ordered, what he paid for, what he had hoped for. He had asked for a bride who could help him, someone he could speak to, someone who understood the world he lived in. And yet here she was, clutching her little box, eyes darting nervously though she could feel every ounce of judgment pressing down on her. The driver cleared his throat. "Name's Mei Lin," he announced awkwardly, pulling a slip of paper from his pocket. "Says here she's bound for Ethan Cole." All eyes turned on Ethan. He stood frozen, his heart hammering. She looked at him then, straight at him. Her gaze was uncertain. But beneath the fear there was something else. Something stubborn. Something strong. Ethan didn't move for a long moment. He wanted to shake his head, to refuse her, to send her back on the next coach east. But when he looked into her eyes, something inside him stirred. Reflection of his own loneliness, his own exile. She was out of place, out of her world, just as he had always been in his. The townsfolk were waiting, whispering, smirking. Ethan realized that if he turned her away now, she would be left stranded, humiliated, and vulnerable in a place that already despised her. Slowly, he stepped forward. His boots crunched on the gravel. He stopped before her, towering over her small frame. She bowed her head slightly, in a gesture of respect he didn't fully understand. She said something softly in her language. Words he couldn't comprehend but spoken with trembling sincerity. He didn't know how to respond. So he did the only thing he could. He touched the brim of his hat, nodded stiffly, and said, "Come with me." Mei Lin tilted her head, not understanding. But when he gestured toward his waiting horse and wagon, she followed. The crowd snickered as Ethan lifted her box into the wagon bed. One man muttered loud enough for all to hear, "West Valona rancher got desperate after all." Laughter followed. Ethan ignored them. His jaw was set like stone. He helped Mei Lin climb into the wagon seat. Her hands were small, but when they brushed his arm, he felt the calluses there. Evidence of labor, of survival. She was no pampered girl from the city. She had endured things he could only guess at. As the wagon rattled out of town, silence stretched between them. She kept her wooden box clutched in her lap, eyes wide as she took in the endless plains. Ethan stole glances at her from under his hat brim, his thoughts a storm. This wasn't what he had asked for. This wasn't what he had imagined. Yet, as the distance swallowed the town behind them, a strange certainty settled in him. Whatever her story was, whatever obstacles lay ahead, this woman, this unexpected stranger, was now part of his life. And though neither of them could speak the other's tongue, their fates were bound from that moment on. The wagon wheels creaked over the dry earth as Ethan drove Mei Lin out to his ranch. The journey was long and quiet, the open land stretching endlessly around them. Ethan had always loved the solitude of the plains, the sound of the wind through the grass, the distant call of a hawk. But now, sitting beside this silent woman, the quiet felt heavier, thicker. Mei Lin clutched her small wooden box to her chest. Ethan noticed she never let it out of her grasp, as though everything she owned, everything she loved, was inside. She looked out at the land with wide, cautious eyes. Her lips pressed into a thin line. He wondered what she saw, a land of promise, or a prison without walls. When they reached the ranch, Ethan helped her down from the wagon. The house loomed before them. 2 stories. Plain clapboard, built by his own hands. It wasn't much compared to homes in town, but it was sturdy. Mei Lin's gaze flickered over it, unreadable. She followed him inside, her small steps echoing on the wooden floor. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of leather and wood smoke. To Ethan, it was familiar. To Mei Lin, it must have been foreign, a house full of shadows and silence. He set her box down by the stairs and gestured toward the kitchen. "Food," he said gruffly, pointing. She tilted her head, not understanding. He repeated louder, "Food," then tapped his stomach. At last she nodded quickly, offering a faint smile. It was the beginning of their fragile communication gestures, single words, looks that tried to bridge the vast ocean between their languages. The first days were full of awkward missteps. Ethan tried to show her the routines of the ranch. He handed her a pail and gestured toward the well, miming how to draw water. She nodded eagerly, but when she tried, the rope burned her hands and the bucket slipped, splashing them both. She gasped, covering her mouth in embarrassment, while Ethan grunted, retrieving the bucket with practiced ease. He wasn't angry. Yet frustration built in him all the same. Everything took twice as long with her beside him, and still the work was endless. He caught himself muttering curses under his breath. Though he knew she couldn't understand. One afternoon, she tried to cook. Ethan came in from the fields, weary and hungry, to find the table set with a steaming dish, unlike anything he had ever seen. Vegetables chopped fine, seasoned with strange spices she must have carried in her box. The smell was sharp, pungent, unfamiliar. He sat, hesitated, then took a bite. The flavor hit him hard, too strong. Too different from the simple stews and cornbread he knew. His face twisted despite himself. Mei Lin's hopeful smile faltered. She lowered her eyes as though ashamed. Ethan pushed the plate away, muttering, "Can't eat that." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. She gathered the dish quickly, retreating to the kitchen, shoulders slumped. Ethan watched her go, guilt pricking him. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but the gulf between them yawned wider than ever. Still, in the quiet corners of life, small moments of grace began to appear. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch. The day's work heavy in his bones. From inside the house, he heard a soft sound singing. He rose and peered through the doorway. Mei Lin sat by the fire, mending one of his torn shirts, humming a gentle tune in her own language. The melody was tender, haunting, like a lullaby carried from a faraway land. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir inside him that wasn't loneliness. He lingered in the doorway, listening, until she noticed him and stopped, her face flushing. He cleared his throat awkwardly, muttered something, and returned to the porch. But the song stayed with him long into the night. Another morning, as he left early for the fields, he found a small bowl of rice on the table. Where she had gotten the grain, he didn't know. Perhaps brought from her journey, hidden away in that little box. She had prepared it simply, without the strange spices. Beside it was a cup of hot tea. Ethan sat and ate in silence. The rice was plain, filling. He looked toward the kitchen, where Mei Lin pretended to busy herself with dishes, stealing glances to see if he approved. He didn't speak. He never spoke much, but he finished every bite. When he stood to leave, he tipped his hat slightly. It was the closest thing to gratitude he had ever shown. Her eyes brightened just a little. Nights were the hardest. The house creaked with old wood and wind. Ethan slept in the bedroom upstairs, while Mei Lin took the smaller room beside it. He heard her sometimes, moving softly in the dark, whispering in her own tongue, perhaps praying, perhaps remembering a family she had left behind. Once, during a storm, the thunder rolled so violently that it shook the shutters. Ethan rose to check the roof when he heard a knock at his door. He opened it to find Mei Lin standing there, clutching a blanket, her eyes wide with fear. She spoke quickly in Chinese, words he couldn't understand, but the tremor in her voice said enough. For a long moment, Ethan stood there, unsure. Then he stepped aside, letting her sit by the fire in his room until the storm passed. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. The crackle of the fire, the steady rhythm of the rain. It was enough to remind them that neither of them was completely alone anymore. And so the days passed, each one a struggle, each one a lesson. They were two people bound by law and circumstance, yet separated by language and culture. Ethan's gruffness clashed with her gentleness. Her foreign ways unsettled his rigid habits. But beneath the silence, something fragile began to grow. A thread of understanding, spun from small kindnesses, from the courage to keep trying, from the stubborn refusal to give up. Neither of them knew it yet, but in the house of silence, love was slowly, quietly, being born. The weeks stretched into months, and Ethan and Mei Lin slowly settled into a fragile rhythm on the ranch. Their house of silence had become a place of slow gestures and clumsy attempts at understanding. Yet, beyond the boundaries of Ethan's land, the world was not so patient. Word of his unusual bride had spread through the nearby town like wildfire. At the mercantile, whispers followed Ethan whenever he entered. Women exchanged glances, their lips curling in disapproval. "Bringing one of them here. It just ain't right," one muttered as Ethan carried his supplies. A group of ranch hands laughed openly on the porch of the saloon, shouting crude jokes about imported wives and cheap labor. Ethan ignored them, as he always had ignored the world's noise. But Mei Lin felt it. Even without knowing the language, she could read the looks, hear the laughter. Whenever she accompanied Ethan to town, she walked a little closer behind him, head bowed, clutching her wooden box like a shield. At home, she pretended not to care. But in the evenings Ethan sometimes caught her sitting by the window, staring into the darkness with eyes that glistened in the firelight. The breaking point came one night in late autumn. The air was crisp, the sky deep with stars. Ethan had ridden out to check on a distant pasture where some of his cattle had strayed. He left Mei Lin at the ranch, promising to be back before midnight. But fate had other plans. As the evening deepened, a trio of drunken men staggered down the dirt road from town. Men who had been mocking Ethan for weeks. They had seen Mei Lin once or twice when Ethan brought her to market. To them, she was not a wife, not even a woman worthy of respect. She was a foreigner, an easy target. They pounded on the ranch door, their laughter harsh and ugly in the night air. Inside, Mei Lin froze. She had been sewing by the fire, her small wooden box beside her. The knocking turned to banging. She stood, clutching her hands together, her heart pounding. The men's voices slurred. But the tone was unmistakable, mockery, demand. "Come on out, little China doll," one jeered. "Let's see what the loner rancher's been hiding," another shouted. Mei Lin didn't understand the words, but she understood the malice. She backed away, fear tightening her chest. When the door rattled under their fists, she snatched up her box and fled out the back, running toward the barn. Her small frame darted through the shadows as the men kicked the door open behind her. Inside the barn, she crouched in the hay, trembling, whispering prayers in her native tongue. She clutched the box to her chest, rocking slightly as the footsteps drew near. The barn door creaked open. The men stumbled in, lantern light swinging wildly. Their laughter grew louder. One of them kicked over a bucket, the clang echoing like a gunshot. "Where you hidin', girl?" Mei Lin's breath came in ragged gasps. She shut her eyes, waiting for the worst. That was when Ethan returned. He had heard the shouting from half a mile away. The drunken laughter carried on the night wind. His heart clenched with a fury he hadn't felt in years. He spurred his horse hard, galloping until the ranch came into view. The sight of the broken door, the lantern light in the barn, the voices of those men. It ignited something deep inside him. Ethan leapt from his horse, stormed toward the barn, and kicked the door open with a force that rattled the hinges. The men spun around, caught mid-act. "What the hell you think you're doing?" Ethan's voice was low, deadly. One of the men sneered, trying to mask his unease. "Relax, Cole. Just having some fun with your lady." The word dripped with mockery. Ethan's fists clenched. "That's my wife." The barn went still. For a heartbeat, silence pressed between them, broken only by the nervous shuffle of boots on hay. Then the biggest of the three stepped forward, puffing his chest. "Didn't figure you for the type to marry, ah." He never finished. Ethan's fist crashed into his jaw with the force of a hammer. The man crumpled into the hay, groaning. The other two lunged, but Ethan fought like a man possessed. Years of hard labor had built his strength, and years of anger gave it purpose. He swung with precision, every strike fueled by rage at their cruelty, at their insults, at the fear they had planted in Mei Lin's heart. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Within minutes, the men stumbled out of the barn, bloodied and humiliated, dragging their unconscious companion between them. They muttered curses, but none dared look Ethan in the eye. Ethan stood in the doorway, chest heaving, fists still clenched, watching until they disappeared into the night. Behind him, a soft sound broke the silence. He turned to see Mei Lin rising from her hiding place, her wooden box still clutched tightly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. But as she looked at him, at the man who had fought for her, who had called her wife, in front of those who mocked, something shifted. She stepped forward slowly, hesitantly. Her lips moved, forming words in her language, soft and trembling. Ethan didn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough. Gratitude, relief, trust. For a long moment, they stood there, lantern light flickering between them, two souls from opposite worlds bound by something deeper than words. Ethan raised a hand, not to touch her, not yet, but to show her he was there. That she was safe. That no one would ever harm her under his roof again. She nodded, tears glistening, and for the first time since she had arrived, Mei Lin allowed herself to believe that this strange, silent rancher was not a mistake, not a burden, not a jailer. He was her protector, and perhaps in time something more. Winter came to the Montana plains with a silent ferocity. Snow blanketed the ranch in heavy drifts. The wind howled through cracks in the shutters, and each morning the world glistened white and unforgiving. For most men, it was a season of hardship. For Ethan and Mei Lin, it became the season when something fragile finally began to bloom. After the night in the barn, after Ethan had fought off the drunken men, and called her wife for all to hear, something unspoken shifted between them. Mei Lin no longer walked the ranch with lowered eyes. She moved with a quiet dignity, her steps more certain, her shoulders no longer so burdened with fear. And Ethan, though still gruff and wordless, found himself watching her with a new awareness, a new protectiveness. The days were filled with work. Mei Lin took to the household chores with steady determination. She learned how to bake simple bread from the flour in the pantry, and though her first loaves were hard as stone, she kept trying until the crust came out golden and soft. Ethan never said much about it. But he always finished the slices she placed on his plate. Sometimes she surprised him with small things. A steaming cup of tea waiting on the table after he returned from the frozen pastures. A mended shirt folded neatly on his bed. A scarf she had stitched from scraps of cloth, clumsy but warm, which she wrapped around his neck herself. Ethan, in turn, found ways to give back. He cut wood for her before she asked, leaving stacks by the door so she never struggled to lift the axe. He repaired the shutters in her room to keep out the draft. And once, when she hummed the haunting melody of her homeland as she cooked, he sat quietly at the table, listening, letting the music fill the silence. Slowly, painfully, they began to bridge the chasm of language. Each evening, Ethan would point at an object, the lamp, the chair, the window, and say the English word slowly. Mei Lin would repeat it, her accent lilting but careful. Then, smiling shyly, she would point at the same thing and say the word in Chinese. Ethan would grunt and stumble over the unfamiliar sounds, making her laugh softly behind her hand. Chair. He'd say. YZ. She would correct gently. He would try again, tongue fumbling, and she would nod encouragingly. In those moments the house of silence began to fill. Not with fluent conversation, but with laughter. With patience, with effort. The townsfolk continued to whisper, but Ethan no longer cared. When he rode into town with Mei Lin by his side, he walked taller. If anyone stared too long, he met their gaze with a steel glare that sent them looking away. He didn't need their approval, he had made his choice. And in time, Mei Lin began to walk beside him instead of behind. Spring came at last, turning the fields green and soft again. Wildflowers sprouted along the fence posts, and calves stumbled in the pastures. Life was returning to the land, and to their home. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of rose and gold, Ethan sat with Mei Lin on the porch. They shared a quiet meal, the air warm with the smell of fresh grass and the sound of crickets. For once, he found himself wanting to speak, not just with words, but with his heart. He cleared his throat, awkward as always, and turned to her. His hands, calloused from years of work, fidgeted against his knees. "Mei Lin," he said slowly, his voice rough. "You wife." He tapped his chest. "You heart." She blinked, trying to piece the words together. Then, understanding, her lips parted in a small, tender smile. She set her wooden box down beside her, reached out and touched his hand lightly. "My home," she whispered in broken English, pointing to herself, then to him. "With you." For Ethan Cole, the loner rancher who had once believed himself cursed to a life of silence and solitude, those words were more precious than gold, more healing than any prayer. He closed his hand over hers, rough and gentle all at once. And in the fading light, no vow was spoken, no preacher stood before them, but something sacred passed between their souls. As the seasons turned, their bond only deepened. They built a life not of grand gestures, but of countless small ones. Her laughter when he mispronounced a Chinese word. His quiet pride when she rode a horse for the first time. The way they would share bread at the table, as though it were a feast fit for kings. The loner rancher had waited for a bride he thought would look and speak like the women he once knew. Instead, fate had sent him someone utterly different. Someone who taught him that love needed no common language, no perfect circumstance. Love, he learned, was built in silence, in struggle, in the courage to reach across an ocean of difference, and simply take another's hand. And as Ethan looked out across his land, with Mei Lin at his side, he knew with unshakable certainty that the emptiness which once haunted him had been filled. Not by the woman he expected, but by the woman he needed. A love beyond words.